The world's sacred texts and ancient stories sit on their library shelves, often bound by the heaviest cover of all, the cover of literalism. To open them expecting only a record of historical events or a list of factual commandments is to miss the library's greatest secret. These are not books of history. They are intricate, nested systems of meaning written in a language that predates the alphabet, the language of symbol and metaphor. This episode is about learning the grammar of that language. It is the practice of looking at a parable, a myth, a miracle, or a prophecy and seeing not a singular dogmatic truth, but a layered psychological and spiritual map. The literal interpretation is often just the outermost shell, a protective husk around a kernel of wisdom that has been deliberately hidden in plain sight. To crack that shell is to reclaim the magic trapped within the very doctrines that may have once felt like a cage. When we begin to interpret scripture symbolically, something remarkable happens. The wisdom we extract often directly contradicts, or at least profoundly deepens, the rigid, dogma-locked interpretations handed down by institutions. A story of external battle becomes a map of an internal struggle. A divine figure becomes a personification of an aspect of our own consciousness. A promised land becomes a state of being, not a parcel of geography. This is the magic hidden within manipulated doctrines. It is the realization that the deepest teachings do not point outward to a separate, distant God, but resolutely inward to the architecture and potentials of our own awareness. This understanding is not a modern rebellion against tradition. It is the recovery of the tradition's original esoteric heart. For millennia, the enlightened custodians of wisdom have operated on this very principle. They knew that direct, exoteric instruction for the masses had to be one thing, while a deeper esoteric truth was reserved for those ready to see it. They planted seeds in plain sight, crafting stories and symbols designed to unfold their meaning over time, revealing themselves only to the eye of genuine inquiry. The Gnostic Christians of early centuries were explicit practitioners of this art. They drew from Plato, the Zend Avesta, the Kabbalah, and the sacred books of India and Egypt, weaving a tapestry where the material world was seen as a flawed emanation from a perfect divine source. For them, the surface narratives of the Gospels were for the general congregation, but within them lay a hidden gnosis, a direct experiential knowledge of the divine spark within. Their language was full of imagery, possessing all the magnificence, the inconsistencies, and the mobility of the figurative style. They understood that Christ himself spoke in parables and allegories, and that Paul's writings contained incomprehensible rhapsodies, the meaning of which could have been clear to the initiates alone. Their entire system was a monumental exercise in seeing the metaphor within the metaphor. This principle of a dual doctrine, one for the public, one for the initiated, echoes far beyond Gnosticism. The philosopher Philo of Alexandria, a Hellenistic Jew, devoted his life to this interpretive art. He declared that for the spiritual seeker, the literal meaning is for the vulgar alone. For those who have purified themselves and raised their consciousness, the historical fact or literal commandment becomes a gross envelope. To such a person, a figure, a word, a letter, a number, a rite, veils the most profound truth. Philo saw the Supreme Being as the primitive light, the archetype from which all illuminating rays of understanding emanate. His work was a masterclass in allegorical reading, insisting that the true source of all philosophy was hidden within the Hebrew scriptures, waiting to be decoded. This tradition of esoteric interpretation is the very cornerstone of Kabbalah, the mystical heart of Judaism. As one text states, the Zohar, a central Kabbalistic work, is the key of the holy books, but it is a locked key. It is true that the secret of this key must be known to enable one to make use of it. The Kabbalistic doctrine holds that the Absolute is the being in which the world is. The world, the literal text, is an expression, but the true being it points to is ineffable and must be approached through symbol, number, gematria, and the exploration of emanations. Sephirot is the system built entirely on the belief that Scripture is a multi-dimensional code to the structure of divinity and consciousness itself. We see this same pattern in the Hermetic and Masonic traditions. Albert Pike, in Morals and Dogma, writes that in all time, truth has been hidden under symbols, and often under a succession of allegories, where veil after veil had to be penetrated before the true light was reached. He speaks of the occult science of the ancient Magi being concealed under the shadows of the mysteries, imperfectly revealed, disfigured, or guessed at throughout history. For these traditions, the building of Solomon's temple is not a historical construction project, but a grand allegory for the building of the inner self. The murder of the master builder, CHiram Abiff, a figure derived from the biblical Hiram, is interpreted not as a literal crime, but as a cosmic allegory. As Masonic scholar A.E. Waite notes, the significance is the allegory and not in any point of history which may lie behind it. CHiram becomes my father, the universal spirit, and his story represents the crucified spirit of good, the dying God, whose mystery is celebrated throughout the world. The magic of this perspective is that it liberates wisdom from the prison of time and dogma. It allows us to engage with a Zen koan, a parable of Jesus, a battle from the Bhagavad Gita, or a myth from the Nile with the same set of tools, the tools of psychological and spiritual discernment. We stop asking, did this happen? And start asking, what is this showing me about the human condition, about the journey of the soul, about the relationship between the ego and the self? When we read of the hero's journey, a call to adventure, a refusal, trials, an ordeal, a transformation, and a return with an elixir, we are no longer just reading about Odysseus or Luke Skywalker. We are reading a metaphorical blueprint of our own awakening. The ordinary world is the comfortable bubble. The call to adventure is the first crack. The ordeal is to friction of contrast and to the confrontation within the shadow. The elixir is the hard-won wisdom we bring back to integrate into our lives. As Joseph Campbell himself stated, mythology is psychology misread as biography, history, and cosmology. The stories are metaphorical expressions of internal archetypal processes. This is the ultimate act of reclamation. It is taking the parchment scroll of inherited belief and realizing we are not merely bound to read its inscribed law passively. We are invited to become the scribe in relation to that scroll, actively interpreting its ancient text in the context of our own lived experience. The scroll may provide the theme, the inherited narrative, but we choose the link with which we write our chapter. To learn this art is to become fluent in the native tongue of the soul. The flood is not just a punishment, it is the cleansing of the psyche. The promised land is not just a territory, it is a state of inner peace and sovereignty. The resurrection is not just a physical event, it is the rebirth of consciousness after the ego's ordeal. Every symbol, every character, every conflict becomes a facet of the great work of individuation. The walls of the library dissolve. We are no longer merely visitors in the halls of others' beliefs. We become archaeologists of our own inner sanctum, using these ancient metaphorical tools to excavate the timeless truths that have always been written, not on papyrus or vellum, but in the very fabric of aware being. The sacred text is finally seen for what it is, a mirror, held up by our ancestors, asking us not to worship its surface, but to recognize the boundless divine consciousness reflected in its depths.